Welcome to Mr. Burley Teaches, a series of lectures for the AP Environmental Science classroom. Today we're going to be looking at ecosystem basics, the components of ecosystems. But before we dive in, I hope that you're awake and alert for this lecture, because it's a very important lecture on the basics of ecosystems. We're going to be going through some important concepts, so I hope you have your ears on and you're alert and ready to take notes, so that we can talk about these concepts a little bit more in depth in the classroom. Alright, so let's take a look here. The ecosystem concepts begin with a discussion of what is ecology and what is an ecosystem. Ecology is the study of the interactions and connections within the natural world. So if you're an ecologist, if you like to get into this area of study, you're going to be dealing with the interactions and connections between all the organisms within ecosystems and how they interact with each other, the living and the non-living components. And that's what an ecosystem is. We can define an ecosystem as the interaction of species and of the living and non-living components of an environment. The key thing here is the living and the non-living components. That's what makes an ecosystem. So you can have an ecosystem that spans the entire globe. A large-scale ecosystem we're going to call biomes. You can have a small-scale ecosystem where you're talking about a rotting log and the life and the living organisms that are interacting with the non-living organisms and the nutrients that are in that decaying log. That can be an ecosystem, something as small as that. So we're going to be looking at ecosystems through the eyes of an ecologist. We're working with the interactions and connections within the natural world. Our first note here to take, we're going to look at what's called the levels of complexity. We're looking at the structure of the living world. And we're going to look at that structure in regards to levels of complexity. It says that down here, the levels of complexity. So we start off here at the individual scale, what we're going to call species. And due to the survival and the reproduction of individual units, we're talking about species. And that's the most basic level of complexity in the living world. And now if you get a group of species together, a group of individuals, we call that a population. Moving right along, moving up this scale here, if you have populations that are now interacting with each other, interacting among species, now you have what's called a community. So if you think about yourself, you are an individual. You're a species of Homo sapiens sapien. You get together with other individuals, other Homo sapiens, we can call you a population. That population, you live within a community. You live within a group of individuals that are interacting with our species. The Souderton community. Moving up along that scale, we then move into the realm of ecosystems. And from the previous slide, we're talking about the living and the non-living and their relationships. So throw in there the nutrient cycles, throw in there the relationship with the sun, throw in there the relationship with the slope of the land and the air and the water, and precipitation. Now you're dealing with ecosystems. And again, those ecosystems can be big, they can be small. The largest scale or the largest level of complexity is called the biosphere. We're talking about everything in the atmosphere, to the lithosphere, and everything in between. All the living organisms that live within rock, within the soil, all the way on the surface, up through the atmosphere. We call this the layer of life. The biosphere. So that's just a little bit of the structure of the living world, and it gives you a visual from the species level through population and community to the ecosystem and then the biosphere. It just kind of separates these things in our mind and gives you something to think about and gives you an idea of what we mean when we say population as opposed to when we say community. With community, it's all about interactions among species. In populations, you're just referring to a group of individuals. So I like this just to start things off here to give us a sense of what we're going to be talking about. This slide just shows you that ecosystems can vary in size and complexity. On the left picture there is an ecosystem that's the size of Yellowstone National Park. All right, and all the organisms of the living and the non-living components that are working together, interacting in different ways in that ecosystem. Or you can have an ecosystem the size of a hole in a log, and all the living and non-living things and components working together in that little area, in that what we're going to call an ecosystem. So you can have a big ecosystem, you can have a small ecosystem, as long as living and non-living things are working together. So let's talk about this concept in regards to population patterns. Alright, so now we're talking about population. Alright, within an ecosystem, the populations, groups of individual species, can display one of three types of patterns. Alright, and the first one's pretty easy, random. Alright, looking over here, we have an example of forest with oak, maple, beech, trees, okay, various types of trees, but they're all randomly dispersed. Alright, there's no order or no pattern. It's a random pattern. There is a pattern, it's random. Alright, the second one, where every single individual stakes out a spot that's pretty much equidistant from others. So every individual stakes out a spot and is spaced equidistant from the others. We're going to call this uniform pattern of population. Right, because everything's uniform, everything's equidistant in that population. Okay, so this is somewhat rare, all right, but it does happen. And you know, an example might be nesting sites. Another example might be if there's a plant that produces a certain toxin and plants won't grow a certain spacing away from that plant. All right, so that would keep things equidistant apart. All right, so that's uniform pattern in population. The last one is called clumped. And this is where things are found in groups. This is typical for animals. In this case, we have the meerkat in this example here in this picture. All right, there's space between the groups, but you have a clumped population pattern. All right, so those are the three patterns in population that we're going to be talking about. We're going to look at examples, but within an ecosystem, those patterns of population come about. And it's important to understand how species are patterns in population, whether it be a plant, animal, whatever. All right, so let's move forward here and look at some examples. Here you go, a school of fish. Think about what pattern of population we're looking at when we're looking at a school of fish. Try to take a guess. All right, hopefully you guessed clumped. Okay, that's an easy one. You have a whole group of individual species clumped together and a lot of space in between that grouping and the next. All right, so a school of fish is a nice, easy example. All right, as opposed to a herd of buffalo. All right, what pattern of population would a herd of buffalo represent? Hopefully you're saying random, okay, because they move around. Here's a water source in the middle of the picture. Some are clumped, some are just spaced out, some are in individual spots depending on the food source. So we have a random pattern in population when it comes to this herd of buffalo. Alright, and then here's a plant in a desert biome that is fairly evenly spaced apart, are equidistant from each other. So we're looking at a uniform pattern in population for this particular plant. Okay, so for whatever reason, some species might take on this pattern in population. Alright, so with that being said, patterns in population is a component of ecosystems. So let's start looking at a different concept, the interactions between species in an ecosystem. Alright, and there's pretty much two types. There's feeding relationships, and then there's non-feeding relationships. Alright, the first one we're going to talk about is feeding relationships, because that's pretty straight up. We're talking about predator and prey relationship, where the prey is the food and the predator is what's hunting the food. And in this example, we have the snowshoe hare being hunted by the lynx. We're going to be looking at, with feeding relationships, we look at a lot of population graphs. And what's important to look at when you're looking at a population graph is the prey, the population of the prey. Because if you notice, the population of the prey goes up and down, it cycles through, but when the population of the prey goes up, the population of the predator goes up. So what you want to look for is a relationship between the predator and the prey, because the prey, the population of the prey, will more or less dictate the population of the predator. Alright, so it's important to be able to interpret and understand the relationships in a graph like this. And we'll be looking at a lot of examples. So one of the components in an ecosystem is the interactions or the relationships between species. And you can have two types of relationships, a feeding and a non-feeding relationship. The feeding relationship would be predator-prey relationship. Alright, so let's look at some of the non-feeding relationships. And here they are. And these non-feeding relationships we can group as being called symbiotic relationships. Symbiotic relationships. Those are interactions or relationships between two species in a non-feeding way. Alright, and there's 6 forms. And we're going to go through these real quick. Alright, I'm not going to really define them, but we're going to go through them real quick in a way that I think is brief but understandable. So let's start off here with amensalism. Alright, amensalism is a symbiotic relationship between two species in a non-feeding way where one species is harmed. So I'm going to put a little negative there. Alright, one species is harmed and the other one doesn't care. So I'm going to put a little circle symbol for that. Alright, so one species is harmed and the other one does not care. So for example, a tree branch falls on a rabbit. The rabbit is harmed, but the tree branch doesn't really care. The tree does not care that its branch fell on the rabbit. That's an interesting example of amensalism. Commensalism is different. Alright, that's where one species actually benefits. Alright, so there's benefit for one, the other one does not care. Okay, so for example, there's a fish out there called remora. The remora fish, and it is a fish that attaches itself to a shark. The remora fish attaches itself to a shark and feeds off the organisms that are stuck on the shark. Okay, so it benefits. The shark, it doesn't really care. Alright, the remora doesn't harm it. It doesn't mind that it's there. Alright, so it's a commensalism type symbiotic relationship. Alright, where one species, the remora, benefits, the shark doesn't really care. Alright, another example might be barnacles on a whale. Okay, competition. Here's where things kind of get interesting. In competition, one species is harmed and so is the other. Alright, both are harmed. And this one is very difficult for organisms because it puts stress. Alright, environmental stress is an interesting thing. There's two types of competition. Alright, there's intra-specific and inter-specific competition. Alright, and these are kind of simple to understand. Just follow me through here. When you play intramural sports, you're playing, two teams are playing from within the same school. So intra-specific are two of the same species. Alright, so when you have an intra-specific competition, both species are being hurt. Let's say you have a deer and a deer are competing for the same food source. Alright, two of the same species, they're both being harmed because there's limited food over the winter, let's say, and they're both being harmed because there's stress there. They're competing for the same resource. Interspecific competition. Interspecific are two of different species. Alright, so let's say there is, over the winter time again, there's a holly bush that's providing berries as food. And two different species of birds are both competing for that one berry bush. Alright, so now you have interspecific competition where both species are being hurt because there's only one bush and there's only so much food to go around. Alright, the fourth type or form of symbiotic relationship here is mutualism. Alright, if competition, they both are hurt. In mutualism, both species are benefiting. Alright, a classic example is the bee and the flower. The bee provides the pollination that the flower needs, and the flower is providing the food that the bee needs. Alright, they're both benefiting. That's mutualism. The next one is parasitism. Parasite. So the parasite benefits, right? And you all know what a parasite is. Something that benefits at the expense of the other species. So, for example, leeches, all right, or mosquitoes have this type of relationship where the mosquito benefits from blood being drawn, but the human is being harmed. This comes into play when we're going to talk about diseases and how diseases cause illness with humans. And that brings us to saphorism. All right, sapphirites, they're pretty much the same as parasites, where they benefit at the expense of another species, but the only thing is that species is dead. Okay, so it's an organism that gets its energy, or let's say nutrients, from a dead organism. So you could say that a saphorite, which is like fungus or bacteria, all right, they benefit by eating an already dead organism. All right, anything that decomposes, all right, they get their energy or their nutrients from a dead organism. All right, so it's not like the dead organism is being harmed technically, but that kind of gives us a nice visual of what saphorism is. And that also gives us a nice visual here for all these non-feeding relationships, which we call symbiotic relationships. It's important to understand how these things work, these relationships and interactions among species. If we're going to understand nature and we're going to try and gain an appreciation for ecosystems, you really need to gain an appreciation and understanding of these relationships. Alright, so here's a couple examples. In the top left, we have fungus growing on a pine cone. Alright, so think about what non-feeding relationship is that an example of. I'll give you a second to think, and hopefully you came up with saphorite. Alright, that's an organism that's feeding off of a dead organism, in this case the pine cone. Top right, you're looking at a bee and a flower. Alright, that's a classic example of a mutualistic relationship. They both benefit. The bee and the flower both benefit. Alright, you should already be thinking about how beneficial bees are and that mutual relationship that they depend on, that nature depends on, that we rely on. Alright, the bottom left might be a little tougher. Alright, depending on the situation, this could be one or two different types of relationships. Alright, if you're looking at this picture, you see a bird landed on a cow, and that bird landed on a cow because there's food on the cow. The bird is picking the insects off the cow. So, does the bird benefit? The answer is yes. The bird is getting food off of the cow's back in the form of insects. The question is, does the cow benefit? The answer is not really. It doesn't really care. Okay, the bird is picking the insects off, but if the bird wasn't there, the cow would live. The insects aren't hurting the cow. It doesn't really matter. The cow doesn't care. So you have commensalism. All right, but you can argue if that bird is picking off ticks or a parasite, then the bird would benefit, all right, it's getting food, and the cow would benefit. Then it would be a mutualistic relationship. So depending on the situation, you have one type of relationship or another. In the bottom right, you have a tree blocking a light. The big tree is not harmed. It doesn't really care. The little tree is being harmed. It's not growing properly, or it's actually being harmed. So we have a mensalism in that situation in the bottom right. Alright, here's another example that I can give you, and this is an interesting case study here of species in a rainforest. We're looking at what's called the Cecropia tree. Giving this to you just in case you see this come up again. So you have the Cecropia tree, which is a very common tree in the tropical rainforest. Or you have an ant, let me minimize that, and you have a sloth, alright, which you just want to give a big giant hug to, or let it hug you. Okay, so what we have here is we have a situation where there's relationship between these species. Alright, so what do these three have in common? Well, let me walk you through this. The Cecropia tree, through photosynthesis, alright, sunlight comes in, through photosynthesis, it's getting its nutrients from the soil, it's creating and producing sugars in its leaves. So there's sugar in the plant, and that's great food for the ant. Alright, so these Cecropia trees become covered with these ants, and sometimes you'll see these called the Aztec ant, otherwise known as the army ant. Alright, these Cecropia trees become covered with the ants, and these ants are aggressive. If you notice, they have real sharp pinchers. Alright, and what happens is when another species like a bird lands on the Cecropia tree and wants to eat the leaves, or let's say an insect lands on that tree and wants to eat the leaves, the ants will immediately attack. Alright, they'll literally shred the other insect or the bird. They'll literally attack it in a very, very aggressive way. So, what we have here is a mutualistic relationship. Alright, let me write down mutualistic between the ant and the Cecropia tree. The Cecropia tree benefits by having the ants on it because no other species comes and eats its leaves, and the ants benefit by getting the sugar. Alright, so you have a mutualistic relationship there. Now, what does the sloth have to do with anything? You have a sloth and a Cecropia tree. Now, you might want to give that sloth a hug. You might not want to give it a hug when I tell you that's not really what sloths look like. Alright, what they look like is this. They have green ink all over them. No, they don't have green ink all over them, but what they do have is algae growing underneath their fur and within their fur. Alright, that's very important because the algae in its fur is a preventative of the ant. Alright, the ant will not attack the sloth because of that algae in its fur. So it will literally repel the ants. So the sloth can now use the tree. It can go into the Cecropia tree, alright, and it has a perfect defense against its own predators. Alright, so you have a different type of relationship here. Alright, think about what type it is. You have a commensalistic relationship between the ants and the sloth. Alright, the ants don't really care that the sloth is there. It's not harming them. It's not harming the tree. It's just there. So the ants don't really care. But the sloth benefits greatly from the ants being there. It can go in that tree and know that the ants will protect it from any other type of organism that might be a danger to the sloth. Alright, so that's an interesting example of a relationship in nature, interactions within this ecosystem between species. Think about that, alright, and we're going to be looking at a lot of different examples, and hopefully you're getting some of these concepts already, and you're already appreciating nature in a different way, in a more higher level.